Nate Diaz says the UFC held him hostage, and to make things worse, they threw him against the most dangerous undefeated monster in the game, Khamzat Chimaev. This is why Nate Diaz hates Khamzat Chimaev. For nearly a year, Nate Diaz publicly accused the UFC of holding him hostage. He wasn't injured, he wasn't refusing fights. In fact, he said he asked for 5 different legitimate opponents and got ignored every single time. In his words, "I've been offered 0 fights in 9 months." Instead of giving him a matchup that made sense, the UFC finally came back with Khamzat Chimaev. And here's why that made Nate furious. Khamzat wasn't just another fighter, he was an undefeated wrecking ball with hype through the roof, destroying everyone in his path. To Nate, this wasn't the UFC giving him an opportunity, it was the UFC trying to set him up. It looked like they stalled him, wasted his time, and then threw him to one of the most dangerous guys in the division just to cash out his name. That's why when Diaz says he felt like a prisoner of his contract, he points directly to Khamzat Chimaev as the UFC's weapon of choice to keep him from walking away clean. In MMA, there's often a tradition. When a legend or longtime veteran is on his way out, the UFC tends to book them in a respectful farewell fight, usually against another aging fighter, or at least a stylistic matchup where they can showcase their legacy one last time. But for Nate Diaz, that tradition went straight out the window. Instead of giving him a chance to bow out gracefully, the UFC matched him with Khamzat Chimaev, an undefeated, younger, stronger, and hungrier fighter who was in his absolute prime. This wasn't a coin toss fight. On paper, it looked like a complete mismatch. Chimaev had smashed through his first opponents with ease, including a Fight of the Year war with Gilbert Burns that proved he was ready for elite competition. So why would the UFC book this fight? Many fans and analysts believe it wasn't just about competition, it was about business. Nate Diaz was one of the UFC's biggest stars, with a massive fan base built over years of iconic fights, wars, and unforgettable moments. By putting him against Chimaev, the UFC could transfer all of Nate's spotlight onto their next big star. If Khamzat crushed Diaz, he wouldn't just get another win. He would inherit Diaz's fans, his credibility, and his momentum. From the outside, it looked less like matchmaking and more like a strategy. Use Diaz's exit as fuel to supercharge Chimaev's rise. For Nate and his supporters, this felt like blatant disrespect. Instead of honoring his contribution to the sport, the UFC chose to send him off against one of the most dangerous fighters alive, almost like they wanted to watch him fail on his way out. That's why so many people call this fight unfair, and why Nate's resentment toward Khamzat wasn't personal, it was about what he represented. The UFC's plan to use Nate Diaz as a stepping stone. If you're enjoying this breakdown and want daily UFC updates, make sure to hit that subscribe button right now. It helps the channel grow and keeps you updated with everything happening in the fight game. For Nate Diaz, the fight with Khamzat Chimaev wasn't just another main event, it was about something much larger, freedom. By the time this matchup was booked, Nate had only one fight left on his UFC contract. And he made it crystal clear what he wanted, to get it over with and move on. He didn't ask for extra money. He didn't beg for special treatment. In his own words, "I don't want no more money. I want to move on. I want to go do my own thing." What Diaz had his eyes on was opportunity. Outside the UFC, fighters like Jake Paul and other free agents were making millions, sometimes more than UFC veterans with 10 times the experience. Nate knew that his name, his following, and his cult-like fanbase gave him the power to cash in bigger than ever before, whether it was through boxing, his own promotion, or huge crossover fights. But the UFC didn't make that easy. They slow-rolled him for months, keeping him inactive while teasing the possibility of a Conor McGregor trilogy, knowing that fight would make the company massive money. Diaz, however, didn't want to wait around for Conor. He wanted action, and he wanted out. So when the UFC finally gave him Khamzat Chimaev, it wasn't just about fighting one of the scariest undefeated prospects in the sport, it was about fighting through the last barrier of his contract. To Nate, Khamzat wasn't just a man standing across the cage, he was the symbol of the UFC's attempt to chain him down one last time. That's why this fight meant so much more than wins and losses. If Diaz survived Khamzat, he wouldn't just leave the UFC with his head held high, he'd leave on his own terms, ready to take on whatever came next. And if Khamzat dominated, the UFC got exactly what it wanted. Diaz's star power fueling the rise of their next big attraction. In the end, this fight wasn't just about Nate Diaz versus Khamzat Chimaev, it was about Nate Diaz versus the system. So what do you think? Was the UFC trying to punish Nate Diaz by giving him Khamzat Chimaev, or was this just business? Drop your predictions in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe to MMA Thread for daily UFC updates.